Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to episode 65 of the Family Ministry Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Blevins, and I'm excited you're listening because today we have three big things to talk about. One, we have our guest, Tony Morgan, and some of you may be familiar with Tony. He leads the Unstuck Group, a team of folks that really work with churches to help them get unstuck. And we talk about his new book, The Unstuck Church, and how that can apply to your family ministry. Because obviously it's written with the whole church in mind, and I think everybody should read it and think about their whole church, especially if you feel like your church is stuck. But even if it's not, and if your church is growing and you feel like it's healthy, you want to figure out why so you can stay in that healthy place and that sustainable health that Tony talks about. But also, I think you can apply what he talks about to your ministry specifically. So you'll love this interview. It's a great one. But before we jump into it, I have two things to announce that I'm really excited about, been working on for a long time, and I hope you'll be excited as well. And here they are. One is mastermind groups for the upcoming school year. I know some of you are thinking, I don't even know what a mastermind group is. That sounds weird. I always think of the movie Megamind. I don't know why. Maybe because I love it. But a mastermind group is just a group of people who serve in a similar role or in a similar context that come together to help each other grow, to challenge each other, to share resources, to have some accountability among each other in the group. And I piloted this last year with 4 different groups. 2 of them for kids ministry leaders, 2 of them for next gen pastors. And I'm so thankful for the people that participated in those. We had a great time. They loved them. And so we're bringing them back this year, but bigger and better. So here are the quick details on these groups. Basically, there will be multiple groups, and I'll talk about the ones that are available in just a moment. But the idea is you'll be grouped with 10, 11 or so other leaders who serve in a similar role and a similar church context to you. And every month you'll have a video call for 90 minutes as a group. And you'll use that as a chance to talk about what's going well in your ministry so that others can steal your great ideas. That's what that's all about. But you also talk about your challenges and the barriers that you're facing so the group can give you input. And then there'll be some topics that we'll just discuss all together because they impact all of us. There'll be a private Facebook group where we can interact, between calls. You'll have 2 opportunities to have one-on-one coaching with the host of your mastermind group, which is great. You'll have access to everybody else in the group throughout that whole time, plus tons of bonuses. We know this is not a small investment. There are tons of groups out there, coaching networks and mastermind groups and the like. And I just personally believe we need a lot more in ministry world. So I'm excited to see ones that have been starting in the last few years. And I just think we need a ton of them. So these groups are a big investment. They're $400 for the 7 months. They run from October through April. And what I'm excited about, though, is we were able to pull together and create and get a bunch of resources to give to you as part of the group if you join. So there's access to another group that we'll talk about in a minute called the Volunteer Playbook Group, designed to help you recruit more volunteers. You'll get that along with Mastermind Group if you sign up for one. Tony Morgan's ebook, Vital Signs, you'll get for free. Jim Weidman's book, Stretch. Gina McLean's book, Guts and Glory of Small Groups. And then 2 kits that will really help you in your ministry. One is a volunteer kit, job descriptions, onboarding processes, all that stuff. And another one is a staffing kit. So especially if you're in a role where you're helping hire staff, there's a strategic staffing ebook, a hiring smart resource, job descriptions for that, and onboarding processes for that as well. So I'm excited about all the bonuses, but the best part is the group. And I have Tony Morgan on the podcast today as my guest. I've participated in 2 of these groups with Tony and paid good money to be in those groups. A lot of it I had to pay out of my pocket because it was more than our church budgets for that kind of thing. And it was totally worth it. I would do it again. In fact, I probably will do it again. I was in the group actually with guys who had been in it 3 times. And in some cases, it was the same content. They just couldn't get it enough. So I know $400 is a lot of money. The goal was to make it affordable to as many people as possible, but not as high priced as some groups that are out there that are excellent. Kind of like, the ones I did with Tony were much more expensive than that and totally worth it. So our goal was to try to make it as affordable as we can, but we know it's a big investment, but we also know it's worth it. So here are the groups, just a highlight of the groups that are available, and we will place you. You'll be able to apply and say which groups you're interested in, but in the end, we're going to place people in groups that fit them and their role in their church context the most. We'll have a Kidmin group or two for children's ministry leaders. I'll lead one of those. If we have a second, I have somebody else in mind, but I can't tell you who that is. So if you have enough interest, we'll have a second group for children's ministry. We'll have one for youth ministry, student ministry, which I can't announce who's going to lead that one yet either, but we will soon, and I'm really excited about that. We'll have a group for next-gen pastors in churches under 2,000 in attendance. I'll lead that group, and that'll be a fun group as we talk about the unique challenges of next-gen in a church that size, anywhere under 2,000. We'll have a group for people who are new to the next-gen role, which is most people. It seems like every time we get together, over half of the people who are in a next-gen role are in their first 2 years. And that's the idea of this group. If you've been in the role for less than 2 years, Kenny Conley is going to lead that mastermind group, and it probably will lean towards a little bit of churches that are a little bit larger, because we'll talk a lot about that new to next-gen stuff in the other one that I lead as well. And then Kenny's also going to lead a mastermind group for next-gen pastors in churches that are over 2,000 in average attendance and size. And so that way we can focus on all the challenges specific to churches that are larger as well. And then also another group, I think many of you will love this. It'll be multi-site, and it's with Kevin Monahan. Kevin and Kenny have both been on the podcast. Kenny's coming up again here, trying to wrangle Kevin again to get him on. But Kevin leads Next Gen at 12 Stone Church. They have 8 locations. They do multi-site really, really well. And so regardless of your role, children's ministry, youth ministry, Next Gen pastor, whatever, this group might be for you if you serve in a multi-site church. So those are the groups that are going to be available. We may be adding some on, like I said. We might have multiple youth ministry groups or multiple kidmin groups with like leaders, facilitators that we'll announce later if that's the case. And one of the bonuses that I forgot to mention, which I shouldn't because it's the one I'm probably the most excited about, is at the end of the 7 months, so these run from October through April, we're going to have an optional in-person gathering in Atlanta hosted by Kevin Monahan and 12 Stone Church with all of us for one day, and it's the Tuesday before the Orange Conference begins. And so whether you're coming to the Orange Conference or not, I think you should. It's amazing, but if you can, we'd love for you to join us. It's no extra cost, just part of the membership of the group, to join us in Atlanta on Tuesday, April 24th. All of the groups together will gather in person, and we'll just have a great day of learning and sharing from one another, probably working through some great stuff together, and coming out of that with even more connections, because that's one of the best parts of a mastermind group, is making those connections and friends and networks that you can then lean into going forward. So I'm really excited about that day. If you jump into one of these groups, I hope you'll be able to make it to that day, that in-person gathering in Atlanta. It'll be a lot of fun. So you probably have some questions. You want to know more about the groups. You can find out all about them on my website. You can just go to the show notes for this episode at nickblevins.com/episode 65, or just click on the mastermind groups image on the homepage there, or even using the menu in the top right corner, you can read more about these. So the other group that I'm really excited about is brand new. So last year I piloted the mastermind group stuff, and it was new, and I'm really thankful for everybody who participated, kind of like guinea pigs, just trying it out, and we improved a lot on the groups for this year. Well, this next group is new this year. So I'm looking for 20 people, and I probably won't call you guinea pigs because that doesn't sound nice, but I'm looking for 20 people who want to recruit more volunteers. And I know that like pretty much all of us listening are like, well, yeah, that's me. Like I could always use more volunteers. But what I'm really looking for is 20 people who could really commit to spending 10 weeks working on their volunteer recruitment. And this group, I'm calling it the Volunteer Playbook Group. The idea is that I think volunteer recruitment is impacted by all kinds of things in our churches. And far too often we want the quick fix or the best idea, like recruitment idea, the one thing that we could do that would be a nice boost. And those things are good, but ultimately they don't create the volunteer culture that we want. And they don't recruit people regularly, month after month, week after week, year after year. And so the idea is we're going to do 10 weeks together as a group. And each week we're just going to work on our volunteer culture from the ground up. So if you go to the page, which you can see on my site, just click on the Volunteer Playbook link or in the show notes, you'll see kind of the plan, the schedule, and you'll probably notice that most of the weeks don't talk about recruitment really until near the end. And that's because we're working to build it strong from the ground up. And so we're going to assess your reality of your volunteer culture. We're going to help clarify your vision and then build the foundation. That's the bulk of the work of the 10 weeks. And then we'll finish with how to grow your team. So we've done all that work to build the foundation and clarify vision and all that. So how do we actually recruit? What are some of the great ongoing things you should do? What are some of the great tools and tips and boosts that you can do to help recruit more volunteers? And then we'll finish with just how do you work on this every week, because you can't just do it for 10 weeks and then be done with it. It needs to be part of your every day, every week kind of routine. So I'm looking for 20 people who want to join that group. It is cheaper than the mastermind groups. And of course it's done faster. It's 10 weeks. It's $200. I will say though, if you join the mastermind group, you get access to this for free. And so obviously that's a better value. But if you just want to focus on building your volunteer team and you want to spend October, November, and I think the first week of December, it'll be every week. We'll have a video call on Mondays at 12 p.m. Eastern for an hour. And then there'll be another 30 minutes or so of Q&A after that. And what we'll do is we'll work on this together. I'll teach that content. We'll do homework during the week, and we'll share all of our resources. So as you're working on your stuff, everybody else will be working on their things, and we'll all share everything. So you have access to everyone's resources, what they're creating, which is another part that I'm really, really excited about. Now, here's the deal. Don't sign up for this group unless you can really give it the time it needs. I think that's one reason. Another reason we struggle with volunteer recruitment is we're so busy, and Sunday's coming every week, and there are other things to do that we don't spend the time on this. So I'm looking for people who can set aside at least 3 hours a week, maybe 4 plus, to actually work on your volunteer recruitment. And that includes, attending the video calls and all that. But it's a pretty big commitment. So you definitely don't want to sign up for it unless you can carve out that time. And I know that's a challenge because one of the things is it seems like you never have time. And I would agree that there's never a great time for it. But there are times that might be a little better. And so if that's not for you now, that's okay. But if it is, I would encourage you to definitely set aside the time. And we'll even talk in the group in preparing for it, how you can maybe cut some things out or change some things to free up time in your schedule so you can actually spend it on volunteer recruitment and building and improving your volunteer culture. So that's way too much talking that I've done now in this intro. It's like the longest intro in the history of podcasts. Sorry about that. Many of you probably skip forward and you're wondering, oh my, he's still talking. How far do I have to go? But if you are interested in the mastermind groups or the volunteer playbook group, be sure to go on my site, apply, sign up. If you have any questions, email me at nick@nickblevins.com. But I'd love to have you in one of the groups. And I think this year we can all get better as leaders. We can help grow our ministries, our leadership, and recruit more volunteers. And I know we all need that. So it'll be a lot of fun. But let's go ahead now and jump into my interview with Tony Morgan about the Unstuck Church. Well, today I'm talking with Tony Morgan. Tony, welcome to the podcast.
Nick, it's great to be with you.
So, Tony, tell us a little bit about yourself and your family, and maybe even a little bit of the history of some of the churches you've worked for in the past.
Yeah. So, gosh, it's hard to believe, but I've been in church ministry now for close to 20 years. And before that, I was in local government. I was a city manager. I used to wear a suit every day to work, and that was a lot of fun back then. My last job as a city manager is pretty crazy. I was still in my 20s. And I had a staff team of 150 people and a $20 million budget, which back then, that was still a lot of money, Nick. So it's hard to believe.
That's still a lot of money. Okay. So maybe not for a city. I don't know, but that's a lot of money.
Yeah. And I was sitting in church one Sunday, and there was a bulletin with an ad for an office manager position. And I leaned over to Emily and I said, Emily, I think I'm supposed to apply for this job. And so we processed it for a few days and prayed through that. And I eventually submitted my resume for an office manager position. And the guys got my resume. They thought I was a bit overqualified for that job, but it started a conversation that led me to ultimately transitioning full time into ministry. And I got to serve at a couple of great churches. At Granger Community Church for a little over an 8-year run there. And then New Spring Church, I worked with New Spring as we were launching new multi-site locations and all kinds of fun stuff happening there. And it was about 8 years ago that I started the Unstuck Group then. And wow, it's been quite a journey over the last 8 years. We've had a chance to work with well over 200 churches now all over the world. just about every part of the U.S. and all shapes and sizes. We've worked with churches under 200 in attendance and over 20,000 in attendance. So we've seen a little bit of everything, and that's been a great journey to help churches get unstuck. That's our primary mission.
That's awesome. It's a great mission, and the name is very fitting, obviously, because every church gets stuck at some point, it seems like. So tell us a little bit about that idea, the Unstuck idea, and then even the book that you just came out with, the Unstuck Church.
Yeah, well, actually, Tom Rainer did a little bit of research for us, at least regarding Baptist churches, just in the last week or so. He was just looking at all the Baptist churches across the country and found that 65% of them are either plateaued or in decline. And that's one type of stuckness that we work with at the Unstuck Group, is the church that they've plateaued or they're in decline, and they're maybe not sure what they need to do to get out of that and to move back towards health. But there's another type of stuck church, and it's probably in that other 35%. They're actually seeing increase. They're seeing growth. They're healthy. But they're stuck because they know there's a next step they need to take, and they're not sure how to do that. So in other words, they're stuck because they don't know how to sustain the growth and sustain the health that they're experiencing. And we have both types of churches that contact us. And the reality is, as you hinted, Nick, it's a reflection of churches that are on both sides of the life cycle. That's what the Unstuck Church is all about. We talk about the life cycle of a church, and we break it down into 7 distinct phases, beginning with launch, and then ultimately moving to sustained health. That's the goal, is to help a church find sustained health. But we see churches that at least 65% of them, according to Tom Rainer, and he's a pretty smart guy, that start to experience plateau and decline. And so there are 3 different phases of the life cycle that move down towards ultimately life support, which is the final stage. And what's encouraging is that the churches that end up in life support, I talk in the book, the Unstuck Church book, there are some next steps that they can take to almost experience new life, a new launch, and for those churches to also move towards sustained health again in the future. But the challenge for those churches is they almost have to become a new church again. And some churches are willing to do that, and a lot of churches aren't. But that's a little bit about what the Unstuck Church is about. It's really identifying the 7 phases of the church's life cycle, and then once a church can distinguish what phase are we in, then we offer some practical next steps about how they need to proceed.
Good. And I want everybody who's listening, they're obviously family ministry leaders, most of them in some role. And so it'd be great for them. We'll walk through kind of the life cycle. It'd be good for them to listen both with their whole church in mind, like where do I think my church is? And then where are the ministries I lead? Where are they? Because they could be different. But before that, I've had a theory of late that I'd love for you to either agree with or totally say is wrong. I've had this sense at times, I guess, that a lot of times, and maybe it's the 35% you talked about, that they're not stuck in terms of plateaued. There's some growth there, but I almost feel like a lot of times the barriers we face in churches, or the problems we face with growth, are more about the barriers than it is creating the growth, if that makes sense. It's not a problem of creating it or getting it going. It's getting the things out of the way. I don't know. That's just like a thing I've thought recently. And maybe that's the 35%. 65% needs to remove some barriers and create some momentum. 35% just needs to keep removing, barriers.
Right.
What do you think about that? Do you see that?
Well, I think what you're getting at is kind of the distinction between 2 of the phases on the left side of the life cycle as we're moving towards health. So I don't know, Nick, do you want me to react to that question specifically, or
save it?
Hit it as we're going through the 7 phases.
Yeah, we could save it. And by the way, I think the 65% you hear, I don't know if you heard this, but I used to hear people a lot of times would say 80% of churches are plateaued or declining. And I don't know where that came from. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's if you want to check out, you should check out Tom Rainer's writing. If you don't follow him, he was specifically addressing that 80% kind of figure that has been floated out there. And I don't know where that came from, Nick. You're right. I had heard that as well, that 80% of churches are either plateaued or in decline. And maybe that is the case overall, but he was looking at hard data specifically for Baptist churches and Southern Baptist churches and found that it was only 65%. And I say only 65%, but gosh, if 65% of the churches, 2/3 of the churches are plateaued or in decline, that's what keeps me up at night, because I figure if we can help those churches find health again to the point where they're reaching people for Jesus, helping people take their next steps toward Christ, and then experiencing some of what we talk about for churches that are in sustained health, boy, that's a win. And the more effective we can help churches be in reaching their community and reaching people for Jesus, gosh, now we're starting to fulfill the Great Commission, and I want to be a part of that. So that's what motivates me, Nick.
That's awesome. Well, I love that. And so that'd be great. Let's go through the cycle, and we'll listen both with like our church in mind, because you would agree that your church could be at one place and your ministry could be at another.
Yeah,
right?
that's true. A great point, Nick. I mean, I want us to be looking at this overall as a church. But every ministry of the church can kind of go through the same process, because different ministries may be at different places on this life cycle as well. But let me kind of walk through the 7 phases. It begins with launch. That's the easy one. That's the beginning. It's not easy, by the way. Churches that are in launch mode, or even ministries in launch mode, there's a lot of work involved with that. But it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the new beginning. The second phase of the life cycle is, I call it momentum growth. And the reason why is there's growth happening, and it's almost like we're not even sure why it's happening, but things are just taking off. And I've been connected with a couple of churches that went through these seasons of momentum growth, and Sunday morning comes around and the doors open, and it's almost like, where did all of these people come from? Because there's just new faces all the time. And so that is a fun season of ministry. And I know several of the folks that are listening have probably experienced that momentum growth. But here's when you mentioned earlier the church that needs to remove barriers, maybe this is where we tend to see the most stuckness, if you will, on the left side of the life cycle. Is between momentum growth and strategic growth, which is the third phase of the life cycle that I write about in the Unstuck Church. And the key distinguishing factor here is you really need to be focused on strategies and systems in this place. We need to have clarity about what's our ministry strategy, and we have to have agreement on what are the key systems, making sure those systems get replicated to sustain the growth and the health of the church. And so it's not unusual for a church or a ministry to run through that momentum growth season and start to kind of feel like the growth slows down, and maybe that plateau does start to creep in, Nick. And it's not because they don't have the momentum there. It's because they can't sustain the momentum, because they need to remove barriers, is the way you described it, by establishing strategy, systems, and structure. And this is when also kind of a new level of leadership needs to be in place, because that entrepreneurialness that got us to this place in ministry, that's a good thing, and we need to continue to embrace that. But there's a new type of leadership built around strategy and systems that also needs to be established here. Otherwise, the church will experience plateau and ultimately decline. And so that's the uniqueness of the strategic growth phase. And I think your description is a good one. It's really starting to remove barriers so that we continue to see health as a church. Ultimately, though, we're trying to move to the pinnacle of the life cycle where the church is having its greatest impact in people's lives. And we call this sustained health. And it's not just about health, it's about sustaining that health. And so what's great in this season, the churches that we see that get to this place in the life cycle, it's not only are they reaching lots of people for Jesus. In other words, we're starting to see multiplication happen at the spiritual level of the church. But there's a replication that's happening throughout the ministry as well. And we see it in different ways. So discipleship is one form of replication where we're helping people become believers, but also helping those believers take their next steps toward Christ. There's replication around leadership. So there are more and more leaders being developed. There's replications in groups or Bible studies or whatever that discipleship path is. There's replication happening in the number of services that churches are offering, or the number of campuses that churches are planting, or the number of churches that churches are planting. In other words, as this replication happens in sustained health, there's almost a movement that's created out of that church. And so it's not just one church in one locations. The church is being multiplied either through services or campuses or other churches. And I know, Nick, even for your church, that's kind of been the vision for the very beginning. It's not just the church, that we're a part of. We want to create a movement where there are multiple ministries, churches coming out of that, and that's what we're looking for in sustained health. Now, the challenge is, not everybody can sustain that for the long haul. And ultimately, a lot of churches start to experience plateau and decline. And so that brings us to the final three phases of the life cycle. First, it's maintenance. And this is a common area where we see churches getting stuck. And so after I describe all of the remaining phases, Nick, we may want to come back to this one in particular, because it's really hard to tell as a church, are we on the left side of the life cycle or in sustained health, or have we crept into this maintenance phase of the life cycle? So it's a bit challenging to discern that, but I can share some characteristics of churches in that phase that may help give a clue to it. And then the final two stages are preservation. And the key in preservation, it's not a good thing, but really it's the church just trying to maintain who we are. We're trying to keep the people that are here currently, and we've kind of lost sight of trying to reach anybody outside the church and outside the faith. And then finally, life support, and this is where the church is just trying to keep the doors open by this point. And financial crisis has set in because they're bleeding people. They're not reaching any new people. And they're really just trying to financially continue to make it so that the church can survive. And that's where I mentioned, boy, if a church gets to that place, there are some options available, but all of those options are really about the church kind of starting over again and becoming a new church again, going back to that launch phase once again. So there's some challenge associated with that. And because of that, we're always trying to catch churches, trying to help them get unstuck before they get to that spot.
Yeah, and I know that you talk about in the book how this is based somewhat on Les McEwen's book, Predictable Success, and the life cycle stages he has there. And I'm pretty sure in his book, he says once they hit that stage, it's over. Like there's no recovery. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I've heard him say that where it's like, okay, but I think you're right in the sense that churches, because they can restart typically easier maybe than some multi-million or billion-dollar company or whatever.
Yes.
They could restart that. But I would imagine kind of like Predictable Success, the odds are pretty low. Like most churches probably don't do that.
God can do a redeeming work though in churches like that, but it takes a committed core of leaders that are willing to go through that change, and that's a big ask. And so it can happen, and I've seen it happen, but those are pretty rare instances.
Yeah, I feel like Carey Nieuwhof, our friend Carey Nieuwhof's story originally was a bit like that. 3 churches that were probably somewhere there, and then now you look back and all that's been done, so it's just pretty cool.
Yeah, that's right.
So what about the maintenance phase? Because I would imagine too that a lot of churches can go from momentum growth. It's fun. It's exciting. We're reaching people, not really ever get strategic growth, and then skip right to maintenance. I mean, does that happen? Yeah. Can you pretty much skip some levels and end up in the maintenance phase?
That's a great point. Not every church is going to go through all 7 phases. And so let me talk about the maintenance phase, because here's what's amazing, and challenging at the same time is it's high up on the life cycle. If this is kind of hard to describe without a visual, and since this is a podcast, let me just try to describe. We're talking generally about a bell curve. You've probably seen a bell curve, and so you start out lower, you kind of rise up, and that picture of the bell curve at the pinnacle is reflecting is that's kind of the highest level of impact that we're having as a church. And so this is that season where we're reaching a lot of people are coming to Christ. And so there's a lot of good things happening. And even in the maintenance season, though we've started down the right side of the life cycle, the right side of the bell curve, there's still high impact. There's still people being reached. There's still probably a lot of people showing up on Sunday morning. In fact, churches in the maintenance season too, they probably have clarity around mission, vision, their strategy. There's no question about that. There's probably a lot of good systems that are in place. And so in many respects, these churches in maintenance, they look a lot like the churches either in strategic growth or sustained health. But here are some of the distinguishing factors for churches that have slipped into maintenance, the maintenance phase, and they may not even realize it. One key one is there's a growing focus on people already connected to the church. And so there may be some intentionality around reaching people outside the church and outside the faith. But the greatest attention, the greatest focus is around people that are already connected to the church. Secondly, oh gosh, why did I do that, Nick? I didn't turn off my notifications on my Android phone, by the way. Android. Okay. I'm going to fix that though, because Android makes it easy for me to do that. You're probably an iPhone user, aren't you, Nick?
I am actually not. I use a Google Nexus phone. I use a Mac computer, but I am.
Okay.
I tell people the reason I do that is because Google runs my life. Like I use every Google service, calendar, Drive, photos, email, you know what I mean? And so it's like, why not just use the phone that just works naturally with it?
Yeah.
You and I are probably in the minority. Most people listening are like, no, we're iPhone users. In fact, I had a friend, I guess on iPhones, if you are not, like if you're texting with a group and somebody's not an iPhone user, it like makes it a different color. Like they identify those outsiders, you know?
Yeah.
So they get prejudice against them. And my friend, we were next to each other at a conference and we had texted all of us in a group and he looked and he's like, hey, you're the reason it's blue or whatever color it's not. Green, maybe. I don't know. One of the colors is, people listening probably know what I'm talking about, but like I had no idea. I was like, I didn't know they targeted us non-iPhone users.
Yeah.
And pick this out. But anyway. Yeah.
Anyways, maintenance. Speaking of Apple and maintenance, so one characteristic then is that they've kind of lost that outsider focus. And by the way, I'm not saying everything that you do should be focused on outsiders, but you should be doing some things focused on outsiders. And that's one of the reasons why churches slip into this maintenance season. Another common issue that we see with churches is this issue of complexity. And over time, churches they accumulate ministries, programs, services, things like that, events. And over time, that accumulation grows to the point where the church just becomes very complex. The calendar becomes complex. The steps that we're asking people to take, particularly new people to the church, becomes complex. The communications become very complex. And so that's another common attribute of churches that are in this maintenance season. Now, here's one that this is the last one I'll share. We cover several more in the book. But this one may surprise you, Nick. One of the other attributes of churches that are in this maintenance season is that their attendance has plateaued or declined, but their giving remains very strong. And I walk through this in the book in much more detail, but it has to do with the giving lag that exists in churches. And we're probably more familiar with that giving lag on the front side of the life cycle when it's a new church and you're reaching new people, particularly people outside the faith. attendance can be increasing, but the giving lags behind because we're reaching new people, and people need to become committed to Jesus before they're going to commit to giving financially. And so that giving lag exists at the very front end of the life cycle. But that giving lag sticks with the church all the way through the life cycle as well. And when you get to the right side of the life cycle, the way it shows up is you'll have an attendance decrease, but the giving can still remain strong. And that just makes sense because you have more mature people by that point, mature in the faith, that is, and they may be mature in age too. I don't know. But as the attendance decreases on the right side of the life cycle, the giving can still be strong. And so that's one of the attributes we see in churches that land in that maintenance phase of the life cycle.
Yeah, I was talking to you about this church before we started recording. One of the churches that we helped plant, they experienced this, to a T. It was attendance had declined. There were a couple different reasons. They had an influx because another church, I don't know if it's split or what, something like that. So they kind of had almost a kind of a growth that wasn't natural. And then, some of that went away, people realized, this isn't my church. I can't make it what I want. They have an identity. And, it was about 1 year, maybe 18 months between like the attendance drop. And then right now this year, if they had known this, I think they would have budgeted way more conservatively because, they're about 15% behind, which is very significant. Yeah. But when you look at the numbers, it's like, well, it's not really surprising because, it matches what you are now, not, That's right. So that is probably something good to pay attention to, or at least plan for, because you're right, it could be misleading. It's like, wait a minute, giving's good. I think everything's okay. Or even if attendance is just, maybe it hasn't even declined, but it's just sort of the same. So again, it doesn't feel like the warning signals are going off, and it could be misleading. So, so if there are like ministries that are in different places of the life cycle than the church. So for someone listening, like, well, if I'm honest, my youth ministry that I'm leading, I'm trying to rebuild it. It's not at the same level of health as the rest of the church. Or maybe it's the opposite. This ministry is actually doing really well, but the rest of the church, not so much. What are some signs of that? Or how does that, I'm guessing it doesn't work long term, eventually.
No, it doesn't. Yeah. And so at some point, if I'm in family ministry, Nick, and I'm overseeing either the whole family ministry area or specifically students or children's ministry, obviously, you need to be focused on health in your area of the ministry and making sure your ministry gets to sustained health. And many of the attributes we talk about in book would still apply specifically to your ministry area. But here's the reason why we fight ministry silos so much, Nick, in churches is a healthy student ministry or a healthy children's ministry, as an example, will not survive in the long run if it's not also in the context of a healthy church. And so at some point, you're probably going to have to figure out, how do I lead up so that and it's not telling the other areas of the ministry, this is what you need to be healthy. I think what you're trying to do is just start the conversation about what could we as a church be doing to, number one, discern where are we as a church on the life cycle. And I can explain some ways that we can help with that, Nick. And the good news is they're free. So I'll explain some of that at the end. But how can we as a church determine where we are on the life cycle? And then as a church, how can we be working together, all the ministries working together to help our church move towards health? I think as family ministry leaders, you're going to have to kind of be working towards both, certainly praying for both. And then, like I said, not only leading the area that you're specifically over, but then trying to lead up in your organization as well, so that you can be initiating that type of conversation as an overall ministry team. Because you may feel good right now if your ministry's healthy and thriving, but eventually you're going to find challenge if the rest of your church is not also in that same spot.
Yeah, I actually think my student ministry was that, when I look back on it, because we grew to 20% of the size of the church, and it hit a lid. And it was more than just the overcharge, because it's not like the church was unhealthy, but I think there were a couple things involved there, just it was a barrier, but 20% is really, really high, and sure enough, that didn't sustain, and it came back down, over the next number of years. And so I look back and think that was like a lot of momentum, but it couldn't make it, because it didn't have the rest of the church growing with it, to support it, things like that. So you talk about in the strategic growth section, which feels like a really important level to me, because when I look at it, it's almost like, I don't want to, maybe you would disagrry, but it seems like where you have to be really, really intentional. Where it's like momentum growth sometimes, I'm not sure how it's coming. Maintenance, things are just happening anyway. It's not where you want it to be. Strategic growth seems like a lot of intention. And you talk about in the book about growth engines.
That's right.
You identify the growth engines of your church and then, build around that. And since this audience is mostly family ministry leaders, from your experience working with churches, can children's ministry and or student ministry be a growth engine? And if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, so, and that's certainly the case. And actually, this might be an encouragement to the folks that are listening to your podcast, Nick, is I would say more oftentimes than not, the churches that we're working with directly on the ground are identifying family ministry, either more commonly all of family ministry or a component of it, student or kids ministry, as one of the core growth engines of the church. And when we're working with churches, when we talk about core growth engines, we're challenging churches to identify 3 or 4. And so, some other examples of growth engines we've seen are kind of the growth track type process, or whatever your next steps path is for the church. Weekend services commonly end up being one of the growth engines. Multi-site strategy is many times a growth engine of a church. Missions outreach, that can be a strong growth engine of the church. And so, they're going to look different, but we're trying to help churches identify. We're not trying to name everything we do as a church. All we're trying to figure out is focus so that we can be intentional. That is a key word. Intentional about these 3 or 4 core growth engines of the church. And by the way, Nick, when we talk about growth engines, we're talking about 2 types of growth. One is the spiritual growth that we want every person to see, not only entering into a relationship with Jesus, but taking their next steps toward Christ so that they can get on mission with the local church as well. But the other type of growth that we're trying to encourage is numerical growth. And I don't shy away from this. I know what my life was like before Jesus and the impact Jesus has made in my life, giving me forgiveness, purpose, hope for the future, healing. I know what I have because of my faith in Jesus, and I want more people to experience that too. And the reality is I still have friends, neighbors, people in my life that don't have that relationship with Christ. And so I want churches to get healthier, and I want them to help believers take their next steps toward Christ. But I really want churches to grow in number as well, because the more churches that are growing in number, the more of my friends, coworkers, people in my life are also coming to faith. And so when we talk about growth engines, that's what we're talking about, is what are those things that can help us grow people in their faith and grow the number of people we're reaching. And I certainly believe family ministry can be one of those core growth engines.
It's interesting because I guess in a lot of contexts, it's not typically, I don't know, maybe you'd say otherwise, but it's not usually what gets someone in the door, so to speak. You know what I mean? A student ministry could be different. A lot of times you can get invites there. In children's ministry, they can invite their friends. But it's almost one of those things where families get in the door, students get plugged in. And if it is a growth engine, well, then they love it and they'll talk about it more and all of that.
Yeah.
Are there some churches that, you have worked with, it's like they clearly have that as a growth engine, that you could describe a little bit about what it looks like or how it actually functions as a growth engine?
Yeah, so I'll give 2 examples. One is an example I'm sure your listeners are more familiar with, and another one you probably never have heard of. So the one that you're more familiar with is North Point. I mean, that's a great example. Their family ministry is certainly a growth engine of the church. Groups is I would argue, one of them. as well. In fact, people don't realize it, but at North Point, they're really more concerned about group participation than they are even weekend service attendance.
Oh yeah. I can't even tell you sometimes the attendance on the weekend, but they can tell you how many people are in groups.
That's right. That's right. But certainly, I mean, you just look at what they're doing in kids ministry and student ministry. It's a core growth engine of what's happening in the church. So you're familiar with that example. But another example that you're probably not familiar with is Rock Point Church. They're in the Austin, Texas area. And specifically student ministry, it is a core growth engine of what's happening in their church. And so their numbers are skyrocketing. The number of families that are connecting to the church as a result of what's happening in student ministry is continuing to increase. And so, and it's just one of many examples, Nick, that I've seen through the years of churches that have really given this intentional focus to making sure they have health in the family ministry, and that health then is driving the overall health of the church too. Yeah.
Who's the pastor of Rock Point Church?
Shane, a good friend of mine, and he was in one of our leadership coaching networks that we offer at the Unstuck Group. And the funny thing with Shane is he went through one group and then decided, no, I want to go through another group. And then I actually think he went through a third coaching network with us at one point. And by that time, he was hearing the same stuff over and over again. But I guess that was helping him in some way.
Sure. Well, the reason I ask is because
were you in one of the coaching networks? Okay.
I was, but I guess because we know names, I don't know church names. I'm like, Austin, Texas, this sounds like Shane's church. I didn't know the name. That's funny. Yeah, we were in that group together.
Shane O'Brien. So if you want to go check out Rock Point Church online, they have a great ministry. Just went multi-site too. So they're in 2 locations now, and God's really using that ministry to impact what's happening north of Austin.
Yeah. I love Shane's aggressive mentality, right? Like just his vision, dreams, he thinks big, and it's really, really cool. So, and I remember in our group, he had made that shift where they stopped having student programming on Sunday morning during services. And you talk about this in the book, actually.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, I don't know if it was about his church, but just this idea. And they moved it to Sunday night, which then opened up the ability for those students to serve on Sunday morning. Yes. And it opened up a possibility for a separate 4th, 5th grade, I think, environment that they put in that same room. Yeah. And what did he say in our group? I mean, it was a huge increase, a doubling of that age, 4th, 5th graders, and all these students serving. And it was really cool. I mean, I came back with that, and I've told that story to so many people. If they do Sunday morning programming for students, I tell them, you might want to think about it. I mean, you might want to think about, doing that. So
there are some churches, they're kind of, particularly churches in urban areas where traffic honestly doesn't make it viable to bring students back on a Wednesday evening. Yeah. So there are some exceptions like that. And that's why North Point does student ministry on the weekends. I think middle school in the morning and high school in the afternoon. But the rest of the country, if you can get students attending a service and serving, your engagement with students is going to be far better than trying to, I think, create these separate worship environments for students on Sunday morning. So that's what I'm noticing, at least with my kids. So I have a very small pool, Nick, of research on this, but it was the serving opportunities that kept them most connected to the church.
I think I totally agree with you. I think that's true everywhere. That was true for me. So my pool's even smaller because it was my experience, but we embraced that at our church. Our pastor was a student pastor for 13 years, led a very healthy ministry from, I guess the church was 300 when he got there. And then the church overall was 3,000. So he saw the student ministry grow, in a big way. And he always was a big proponent of students in the service on Sunday mornings and being able to serve that way. Like when they graduate, it's not that different. They're not doing the student ministry thing anymore, but they've already been doing the Sunday morning thing and the serving thing. So that's not a big step. So you mentioned earlier, you talked about if your ministry is at a different place in the life cycle than the church leading up. And I think that could be a position for a lot of people listening. And this is a question everybody wants to know the answer to. And it could be a whole podcast on its own, but is there anything any advice you could give them about how to lead up, what to do when you're in that position where you don't have the authority, but you want to do something about it. Like you care, like practically, what could they do? Cause you can't make the decision, and you can't, you know what I mean? You got to honor your leadership and still help as much as you can.
Yeah. So, you're asking it in the sensible way, Nick. Other times I'll hear people kind of more pointedly ask, how do I change my pastor, as an example? Because
that's not a good approach.
Yeah, that's not a good approach. In fact, usually my reaction to that is, are you married? And if so, when was the last time you changed your spouse? Because it's kind of the same thing. You're not going to change your spouse, and you're not going to change your pastor. But what you could do is start praying for your pastor, because in many instances, pastors are engaged in ministry and in a season of ministry they've never been before. So they're still learning too. And so I would begin praying for your pastor. And the most fascinating thing I've noticed when I start praying for somebody like that is usually God starts pointing to me in things that I need to be addressing, or attitudes that I have in myself that need to be fixed. And so don't be surprised if you get a little bit of conviction of some specific areas in your own leadership, or your own attitude that need to be addressed as you start to do that. And then the other coaching I would give is, look at it as how do I start a conversation rather than how do I initiate change? Because if you can start a conversation with the rest of your team, the team, and including your pastor, may get to a place where they're open to change at that point. But if you come in trying to push a change, push a new approach, you're probably not going to gain much traction with that tactic. And so instead, I would encourage you, here's a resource that's working in my ministry. Maybe we should read through this together. Or I'm going to tell you in a moment, here's an assessment that I heard Tony Morgan offering for every church to take. Maybe we should consider taking this assessment together and kind of see where we are and what next steps we could take. So if it's more around starting a conversation rather than pushing some sort of change, I think you're going to have more success as well. But begin with praying for the leaders above you. I think that's going to be a good thing.
Yep, definitely. So what is the assessment, and how can people connect with you, like with the book and the assessment and some of that stuff?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do is go to your favorite browser and type in the Unstuck Church.com, theunstuckchurch.com. And that'll bring you to a website that gives you a general overview of the 7 phases that we talked through, Nick. It gives you a link to the book, which obviously I want to encourage you to pick that up. And then the other thing that you'll find there is a link to the free assessment. And the assessment is designed so an individual can do it on their own, or your team can do it together. And I really want to encourage, do it as a team. And the reason why is the results will be much stronger if there are many voices kind of speaking into that assessment process. And if you do that then, and it's a free assessment, what you'll end up with then is not only a clear picture of where your church is on the life cycle, but we generate some specific next steps that your team can take as well. And so again, it's the unstuckchurch.com, and you can check out the book resource, and then the free assessment is also available there.
Great. And you have more coaching networks coming up, right? Am I right about that? That you're taking signups for new ones?
Yeah, we're always.
And I was going to say you've attached even some of those growth barriers to them, like getting to 1,000, breaking 2,000. Yeah. So yes, people ask me, well, what does the Unstuck Group really do? It's those two things, Nick. We provide coaching for leaders, and then we provide consulting for churches. And so if you start to dig into some of this and you're looking for specific help for your leadership or for your church, we do offer both coaching and consulting through the Unstuck Group. That's great. And then obviously, I think everybody should look into it. I think it's, I've been in 2 of your coaching networks. Like Shane, I haven't done 3. So I've done 2. And they were hugely beneficial. And most of them are lead pastors, executive pastors. But even for me, it was very easy to take what we talked about and translate it to my ministry. which was great. And you've come in and worked with our church in the past, and we're talking about doing that again. And so I can't, recommend you guys enough. I think everybody should check that out. And we'll put all those links in the show notes, probably even like a picture of the life cycle if somebody's listening and they can look at it, but the book and the website and the assessment and all that. So yeah, any other way people can connect with you, maybe Twitter or anything like that you want to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, everything's at Tony Morgan Live. So Twitter, Facebook, and my personal website, where we're trying to write on a regular basis about ministry, strategy, and leadership. So look for TonyMorganLive.com. And that's only because I wasn't quick enough to figure out how to get TonyMorgan.com. So I'm just I wasn't as tech savvy, I guess.
And a pretty common name, I would imagine, because that was a long time ago, right? I'm thinking right now, I feel like it's been a decade since I've seen your writing. So you were in there kind of early, and somebody still had it.
But not early enough.
Yep, somebody got it. That's great. Well, Tony, thanks for coming on the podcast and talking about this. Love the book. I think it's really helpful for churches, but also just ministry. So I hope everybody listening will get it, read it, do the assessment, and try to figure out where their ministry is in the life cycle. So thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Wow, Tony's a great leader, and I am so thankful for his influence on my life and our church over the years. I've followed him for 10 years now, learned so much from him. I mentioned our church has worked with him and the Unstuck Group to help us. In fact, we're bringing Tony in again this fall, which I'm really excited about. And I hope that interview was helpful for you as well. Obviously, Tony works a lot with senior leadership teams and pastors and executive pastors, and the book has that, has your whole church in mind, but it very much can be applied to your ministry. And if I were you, I would think about my whole church as well, because I want my whole church to be healthy, not just my ministry. So I think some action items coming out of that interview could be to get the book. Obviously, it's a great book. Take the assessment, the free assessment that they have on their site, and then take one step towards health. What's one step you can take towards sustainable health, depending on where you are? And the book gives you some ideas for that. Just take one step, because I know it's hard to think about the 55 things that you want to do. What's one step you can take this week towards health in your ministry or in your church overall? You can get all the show notes for everything we talked about at nickblevins.com/episode 65. While you're there, be sure to check out the mastermind groups and the volunteer playbook groups. See if that's something you would be interested in. And if you have any questions, let me know. Next week on the podcast, I have Jessica Beeler, and we talk all about multi-site kidmin. What does it look like to do children's ministry in a multi-site context? But you'll love it regardless of whether or not you serve in children's ministry or not, or if you're in multi-site or not, because there's just plenty of things to take and apply to your ministry. We're also giving away a great new free resource. If you do lead in children's ministry, you don't want to miss that. It's a PDF resource that has samples of what a bunch of churches give to first-time families at their church, and it's great. Some churches are doing amazing things. Elevation is featured in there, the stuff that Jess talks about. So that resource will be available next week. If you subscribe to my email list, you'll get that in advance. But if not, you can get it in the show notes for the episode next week, which I hope you read every week, because usually we have some great resources in there that guests bring as well, and then they share. And Jess actually does that in that episode, so you'll love that. Until then, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And next week, you'll get to hear from Jessica Beeler. See you then.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.